The hallway outside courtroom 8 buzzed with whispers. Lawyers clutched their leather briefcases tighter, and clerks slowed their hurried pace, stealing glances at the tall figure sitting alone on a bench near the water fountain. Clint Eastwood, with his trademark squint and weather-beaten face, looked out of place among the suits and ties. But then again, he had always been a man who stood out in a crowd. At 95 years old, Eastwood wasn't as quick on his feet as he once was, but the mind behind those piercing eyes remained sharp as ever. He straightened his navy blue tie and glanced at his watch, a simple timepiece, not the flashy kind most Hollywood stars preferred. In 15 minutes, he would walk through those heavy wooden doors and face Judge Rebecca Henderson in a property dispute that had been brewing for nearly 3 years. "Mr. Eastwood?" A young man with wire-rimmed glasses approached nervously. "I'm Peter Wilson, your attorney Tom's assistant. He asked me to tell you he's running about 10 minutes late. Traffic on the 101 is terrible this morning." Eastwood nodded. "That's fine. Not my first time waiting around on a set." His voice was that same famous gravelly rumble that had delivered countless memorable lines over his decades-long career. The young man laughed a bit too eagerly and backed away, clearly starstruck. An older court officer walked by, did a double take, and smiled. "My wife's not going to believe this. She's watched Gran Torino about 20 times. Tell her thanks," Eastwood said with a small smile. He was used to this, the recognition, the reverence, but today it felt different. Today he wasn't Dirty Harry or the man with no name. Today he was just a property owner fighting for what was rightfully his. The dispute centered around 5 acres of land adjacent to his Carmel-by-the-Sea estate. The developer, Coastal Vision, LLC, claimed their surveys showed the boundary line fell in their favor, giving them rights to build luxury condos on land Eastwood had considered his for decades. Land where deer grazed in the early morning mist and where he often walked to clear his head and think about his next film project. His phone buzzed. A text from his daughter. "Knock 'em dead, Dad. But not literally. Save that for the movies." The corners of his mouth turned up slightly. His family had always kept him grounded, reminded him that despite all the fame and accolades, he was still just a man trying to do right by himself and others. The courtroom doors swung open, and a bailiff announced that Judge Henderson was ready to begin the day's proceedings. Eastwood stood up, feeling a slight twinge in his lower back, a reminder of a stunt gone wrong on the set of The Eiger Sanction some 50 years ago. "Mr. Eastwood?" It was Peter again, looking flustered. "Tom just called. His car broke down. On the highway. He's trying to get here as quickly as possible, but he says to tell Judge Henderson he'll be at least 45 minutes late." Eastwood's face remained impassive, but inside he felt a flicker of annoyance. He'd been in this business long enough to know that punctuality was a form of respect. "All right," he said simply, and walked into the courtroom alone. The room fell, silent as he made his way down the center aisle. Judge Rebecca Henderson, a woman in her early 60s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, looked up from her papers. Her reputation preceded her, tough, no-nonsense, and famously unimpressed by celebrity. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, peering over her reading glasses. "I see you've decided to grace us with your presence, but where is Mr. Chambers?" "Car trouble, Your Honor," Eastwood replied. "He's asked for a 45-minute delay." The judge checked her watch and frowned. "That's unfortunate, as we have a full docket today." She looked at the opposing counsel, 3 immaculately dressed attorneys from one of Los Angeles's most prestigious firms. "Are you prepared to begin, Mr. Reynolds?" The lead attorney, a slick man with perfectly coiffed hair, stood. "Absolutely, Your Honor." Judge Henderson nodded, and then fixed her gaze back on Eastwood. "Well, Mr. Eastwood, it seems we have a dilemma. Would you prefer to reschedule, or would you like to begin without your attorney present?" Before Eastwood could answer, the judge added with unmistakable sarcasm, "I understand in Hollywood you can simply yell 'cut' when things don't go according to script. But unfortunately, the California Superior Court operates differently." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The judge wasn't finished. "Just because you've played lawyers and lawmen on screen doesn't mean you understand real legal proceedings. This is not Dirty Harry Goes to Court." Eastwood's face remained stoic, though something flickered behind his eyes, not anger, but determination. Throughout his career, he'd been underestimated many times. Sometimes that had worked to his advantage. "I understand, Your Honor," he said calmly, "and I'm prepared to wait for my attorney. But with respect, I'd like to note for the record that I've never played a lawyer in film. A few cops, sure, a Secret Service agent once, even a retired NASA pilot, but never an attorney." The factual correction, delivered without a hint of defensiveness, caught the judge off guard. The corners of Eastwood's mouth turned up almost imperceptibly, the same subtle half-smile moviegoers had seen countless times. "Duly noted, Mr. Eastwood," Judge Henderson replied, not entirely able to mask her surprise at being corrected. "We'll take a 30-minute recess. If your attorney hasn't arrived by then, we'll need to reschedule." As the judge rose to leave, Eastwood remained standing, hands clasped in front of him. The opposing legal team huddled together, occasionally glancing his way with smug smiles. They clearly thought this delay favored them, a small victory in what promised to be a contentious legal battle. What they didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew, was that Clint Eastwood had been preparing for this case with the same intensity he brought to his film roles. For 6 months, his dining room table had been covered with law books, property records dating back to 1952, and survey maps from 5 different decades. He'd stayed up late into the night, reading glasses perched on his nose, studying California property law with the help of a retired judge who owed him a favor. In the hallway outside, Eastwood found a quiet corner and called Tom Chambers himself. "Where are you exactly?" he asked when his attorney answered. "About 20 miles out. AAA is here, but this could take a while," Tom replied, sounding stressed. "Judge Henderson giving you a hard time?" "You could say that," Eastwood said. "She's given us 30 minutes, then she'll reschedule. That might be for the best," Tom sighed. "I've got all our exhibits in my car. Without them, I brought copies," Eastwood interrupted. "The ones we went through yesterday." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You brought everything? The surveys? The original deed? The Coastal Commission reports?" "Yep," Eastwood confirmed. "Figured it couldn't hurt to have backups." Tom Chambers laughed softly. "You know, in 40 years of practicing law, I've never had a client as prepared as you. Most people just show up and expect me to do everything." "I've never been most people," Eastwood replied. After hanging up, he sat quietly, reviewing mental notes. The hallway had mostly cleared out, but a young woman approached hesitantly. She wore the badge of a court reporter. "Mr. Eastwood, I just wanted to say I'm a huge fan. $1 Million Baby changed my life. It's why I went to law school." He looked up, genuinely surprised. $1 Million Baby made you want to be a lawyer, not a boxer?" She smiled. "It showed me that fighting for someone else's dignity matters. That's what good lawyers do, right?" Eastwood nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose they do." As she walked away, his phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Tow truck taking forever. Not going to make it in 30. Sorry." Eastwood slipped the phone back into his pocket and took a deep breath. In his decades in Hollywood, he'd learned that sometimes the most compelling scenes happened when things didn't go according to plan, when an actor had to improvise to find their own way through the story. The bailiff appeared at the hallway entrance. "Mr. Eastwood, Judge Henderson is ready to resume." As he stood up, straightening his tie once more, Eastwood felt a familiar sense of calm focus wash over him. The same feeling he got before calling action on a film set. Judge Henderson thought she had him figured out, thought she knew exactly who he was based on the characters he'd played. She was about to discover how wrong she was. Back in courtroom 8, Judge Henderson was already seated, her expression making it clear that her patience was wearing thin. Eastwood entered alone, carrying a leather portfolio under his arm. "Mr. Eastwood, I see your attorney is still absent," the judge said, checking her watch. "As I mentioned earlier, we have a full docket today. Are you requesting a continuance?" Before Eastwood could answer, Raymond Reynolds, the slick lead attorney for Coastal Vision LLC, stood up. "Your Honor, my clients have flown in specifically for today's hearing. A delay would cause considerable inconvenience and expense." Eastwood placed his portfolio on the table and looked directly at Judge Henderson. "No need for a continuance, Your Honor. I'm prepared to proceed." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Eastwood, while I admire your enthusiasm, this is a complex property dispute with significant legal implications. Are you suggesting you wish to represent yourself?" "Temporarily," Eastwood replied in his measured, gravelly voice, "until Tom arrives." Judge Henderson leaned forward, removing her glasses. "Mr. Eastwood, there's an old saying in legal circles. A man who represents himself has a fool for a client. Are you familiar with it?" "I am," Eastwood said. "I'm also familiar with another old saying, preparation meets opportunity." A slight murmur rippled through the spectators. Judge Henderson sighed deeply. "Very well. But I must warn you, I won't be making special accommodations because of who you are. In this courtroom, you're just another litigant, not a Hollywood icon." Eastwood nodded. "That's exactly how I want to be treated, Your Honor." The judge gestured toward Reynolds. "Counsel, you may proceed with your opening statement." Reynolds buttoned his expensive suit jacket and approached the bench with practiced confidence. For 20 minutes, he laid out Coastal Vision's case with polished precision, displaying large aerial photographs and property surveys on an easel. "As you can see, Your Honor," Reynolds concluded, "the boundary markers clearly indicate that the disputed 5 acres fall within our client's development rights. Mr. Eastwood's claim relies on outdated surveys and, frankly, a sense of entitlement to land he simply doesn't own." Judge Henderson nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds." She turned to Eastwood. "Your response, Mr. Eastwood?" Eastwood rose slowly. At 95, his movements weren't as fluid as they once were, but there was a deliberate dignity to them. He opened his portfolio and removed a single sheet of paper. "Your Honor, I'd like to begin by addressing Mr. Reynolds's claim about entitlement." His voice was quiet, forcing everyone to lean in slightly to hear him, a technique he'd used in films to command attention. "I've lived in Carmel for over 50 years. In that time, I've served as mayor, established wildlife preserves, and donated land for public use. My connection to this property isn't about entitlement. It's about stewardship." He paused, looking directly at the 3 attorneys across the aisle. "Coastal Vision LLC was formed 16 months ago, specifically to develop luxury condos in an area known for its natural beauty. They've never stepped foot on this land except to measure how many million-dollar units they can squeeze onto it." Reynolds jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Eastwood is making inflammatory statements without legal relevance." "I'm providing context," Eastwood countered calmly. Judge Henderson considered this. "I'll allow it. But Mr. Eastwood, please stay focused on the legal aspects of your claim." Eastwood nodded and pulled several documents from his portfolio. "May I approach, Your Honor?" After receiving permission, he placed the documents before the judge. "These are the original property records from 1952, when this land was first parceled. You'll notice on page 3, paragraph 2, there's specific language about the natural boundary line following what was then called Cypress Creek." Judge Henderson studied the documents. "And your point, Mr. Eastwood?" "Cypress Creek has shifted over the decades due to natural erosion, about 30 feet eastward. Coastal Vision's surveys ignore this historical context and instead rely on fixed distance measurements from scenic road." Reynolds scoffed audibly. "Your Honor, property lines aren't determined by shifting creek beds. They're established by precise measurements, which our surveys clearly demonstrate." Eastwood reached into his portfolio again. "Actually, California law recognizes natural boundaries in several precedents." He pulled out a dog-eared legal text with colored tabs marking various pages. "In Gillespie v. Westbrook, 1972, the California Supreme Court held that when a deed specifies a natural landmark as a boundary, the intent was to follow that landmark even if its precise location shifts over time." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Henderson looked genuinely surprised as she accepted the law book from Eastwood and examined the highlighted passage. "I wasn't aware of this precedent," she admitted, glancing up at Reynolds, who was frantically whispering to his colleagues. "Few people are," Eastwood replied. It's not widely cited because most property disputes involve urban lots with fixed boundaries. But for rural and coastal properties, natural boundaries have legal standing. Reynolds recovered quickly. Your Honor, even if we accept this obscure precedent, Mr. Eastwood would need to prove that Cypress Creek has indeed shifted, and by exactly how much. Without expert testimony. I have that as well, Eastwood interrupted, producing a sealed envelope. This contains a geological survey conducted by Dr. Howard Ramirez of Stanford University, documenting the creek's movement over the past 70 years using historical aerial photography and soil analysis. Judge Henderson accepted the envelope. Mr. Eastwood, I must say I'm impressed by your preparation. However, Mr. Reynolds raises a valid point about expert testimony. Dr. Ramirez would need to appear in court to authenticate this report and face cross-examination. He's available by video conference at your convenience, Your Honor, Eastwood replied. I anticipated this issue. A hint of a smile crossed Judge Henderson's face, quickly suppressed. Of course you did. Reynolds, looking increasingly uncomfortable, approached the bench. Your Honor, we weren't given proper notice about this expert witness or his report. This is a clear violation of discovery procedures. Judge Henderson turned to Eastwood with a raised eyebrow. Mr. Reynolds has a point. Was this report shared during discovery? Eastwood nodded. It was included in the third batch of documents my attorney provided 2 months ago, page 147 of the production to be exact. He pulled out another file. I have the signed receipt acknowledging delivery. Reynolds conferred hurriedly with his associates, flipping through their documents. After a moment, one of the junior attorneys whispered something in his ear. Reynolds' confident demeanor faltered visibly. It appears we may have overlooked this particular document, Your Honor. We receive voluminous filings and occasionally. Yet you found time to review all the documents that supported your case, Judge Henderson observed dryly. Interesting. Priorities, Counselor. A few spectators chuckled. Eastwood remained stone-faced, but a glimmer of satisfaction showed in his eyes. The judge checked her watch. Given these developments, I think we should take an early lunch break. When we return, I'd like to hear more about this geological survey and its implications for the property boundaries. She looked at Eastwood. Perhaps by then your attorney will have joined us. Thank you, Your Honor, Eastwood replied with a respectful nod. As the courtroom began to clear, Reynolds approached Eastwood. That was quite a performance, he said, keeping his voice low. But this isn't one of your movies where the hero always wins in the final act. Eastwood gathered his documents unhurriedly. You know what the difference is between movies and real life, Mr. Reynolds? The attorney waited for the punchline. In movies, Eastwood continued, the script is already written. In real life, you have to write it as you go. He closed his portfolio with a decisive snap. And I've always preferred directing to acting. Anyway. In the hallway, Eastwood found a quiet bench and checked his phone. A text from Tom. Still waiting for the tow. How bad is it? Eastwood typed back. Not bad at all. Take your time. He put the phone away and stared out the window at the California sunshine. Truth was, he was enjoying this. Throughout his career, people had often mistaken his on-screen personas for his real self. Assuming he was just a tough guy with a gun and a scowl, few recognized that his success as a director came from meticulous research, careful preparation, and an eye for details others missed. Today, Judge Henderson and Raymond Reynolds were learning what many Hollywood executives had discovered over the decades. Underestimating Clint Eastwood was almost always a mistake. A court clerk approached, looking nervous. Mr. Eastwood, Judge Henderson would like to see you in her chambers before we reconvene. Eastwood nodded and followed the young man down a quiet corridor to the judge's private office. He knocked once on the heavy wooden door. Come in, called Judge Henderson's voice. She was seated behind a large desk, his documents spread out before her. She gestured to a chair opposite her. Mr. Eastwood, I've been reviewing these materials. I must admit I'm both impressed and curious. She leaned forward. Why didn't your attorney lead with this creek boundary argument? It's considerably stronger than the case you've presented in your filings. Eastwood settled into the chair. Tom's a good lawyer, but he tends to rely on conventional arguments. The creek boundary approach was my idea, based on some research I did on my own. Judge Henderson studied him with newfound respect. Most people in your position would just write checks to lawyers and show up when told to. I've never been much for sitting on the sidelines, Eastwood replied simply. The judge nodded thoughtfully. Well, I owe you an apology for my earlier remarks. I made assumptions based on who you are. No apology needed, Your Honor. I've dealt with assumptions my whole life. He paused, then added with the hint of a smile. Some of them have even been right. For the first time, Judge Henderson laughed genuinely. Fair enough, Mr. Eastwood. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. As Eastwood rose to leave, she added, and I look forward to seeing where this creek boundary argument leads us. Eastwood nodded and headed for the door. So far, everything was going according to plan, and he hadn't even played his strongest card yet. After lunch, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Word had spread about Eastwood's unexpected legal prowess, drawing a larger crowd than the morning session. Several law students had slipped in, notepads ready, eager to witness what was quickly becoming the talk of the courthouse. Eastwood sat alone at the defendant's table, reviewing his notes. He'd received another text from Tom. The attorney was now in a rental car, but still at least an hour away. Strangely, Eastwood felt no anxiety about this. There was something pure about facing this challenge on his own terms, relying on no one but himself. It reminded him of his early days as a director when studio executives doubted his abilities, and he had to prove himself with every frame. The bailiff called the court to order as Judge Henderson entered. She seemed different now, more attentive, her earlier condescension replaced by genuine curiosity. Before we continue, she began, Mr. Eastwood, has your attorney provided an update on his arrival? He's on his way, Your Honor, but still some time out. She nodded. Very well. We were discussing the geological survey regarding Cypress Creek's movement. Are you prepared to elaborate on this point? I am, Eastwood confirmed, rising slowly. He approached the evidence table and set up 3 large mounted photographs. These aerial shots show the creek's path in 1952, 1985, and 2023. The gradual eastward shift is clearly visible. Reynolds stood quickly. Your Honor, while these photographs may be interesting, they hardly constitute scientific evidence of boundary changes. We need more than old pictures to overturn established property lines. Judge Henderson frowned slightly. I believe Mr. Eastwood mentioned expert analysis accompanying these photographs, Mr. Reynolds. That's correct, Eastwood said. He pulled out a tablet computer. Dr. Ramirez has prepared a presentation explaining his methodology and conclusions. With the court's permission, I'd like to connect to his video conference now. The judge nodded, and a court technician helped set up the video call. Soon, the face of Dr. Howard Ramirez, a bearded man in his 60s, appeared on the courtroom's display screen. After establishing the doctor's credentials, 30 years as a geomorphologist specializing in coastal erosion patterns, Eastwood guided him through a series of questions about Cypress Creek. Dr. Ramirez, based on your analysis, how much has the creek shifted since the original property boundaries were established in 1952? The scientist adjusted his glasses. Using historical aerial photography, soil core samples, and vegetation pattern analysis, I've determined the creek has shifted eastward approximately 32 feet at its southern end and 28 feet at its northern end over the past 71 years. And in your expert opinion, what caused this shift? 3 primary factors, Dr. Ramirez explained, using digital overlays to illustrate his points. First, natural erosion patterns common in coastal regions. Second, the severe El Niño storms of 1983, which significantly altered many waterways in the area. And third, gradual changes in groundwater levels affecting the creek's path. Eastwood nodded. Thank you, Doctor. And based on the original deed's language specifying the creek as the property boundary, what would be your conclusion about the current boundary line? In my professional opinion, the boundary should follow the creek's current path, not its 1952 location. This aligns with standard geological and cartographical practices for natural boundaries. Reynolds stood for cross-examination, his earlier smugness now replaced by intense concentration. Dr. Ramirez, isn't it true that man-made structures can affect creek migration patterns? Certainly, the scientist agreed. And are you aware that in 1978, a retaining wall was built on Mr. Eastwood's property near the creek? Dr. Ramirez nodded. Yes, I noted that in my report. However, the wall was built approximately 50 feet from the creek bank precisely to avoid interfering with natural water flow. My analysis shows the creek's migration pattern was consistent both before and after the wall's construction. Reynolds pressed on, but with each question Dr. Ramirez responded with clear, factual answers that supported Eastwood's position. After 30 minutes of increasingly desperate questioning, Reynolds conceded with a frustrated, "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Henderson thanked Dr. Ramirez for his testimony, and the video connection ended. She turned to Eastwood. "Do you have additional witnesses?" "Just one, Your Honor," Eastwood replied. "I'd like to call Frank Donovan." A murmur ran through the courtroom as an elderly man with a cane made his way to the witness stand. After being sworn in, he settled into the chair, nodding respectfully toward Eastwood. "Mr. Donovan, could you tell the court your age and occupation?" Eastwood began. "I'm 91 years old, retired now, but I worked for the Monterey County Land Surveyor's Office from 1949 to 1988. And in what capacity did you work there?" "I started as a field surveyor, then became chief cartographer in 1963. I was responsible for maintaining the county's official property maps and records." Eastwood approached the witness with a document. "Do you recognize this?" Donovan put on reading glasses and examined the paper. "Yes, this is a survey certificate I signed in 1952 for the original parceling of the Eastwood and adjacent properties. Were you present when the boundaries were established?" "I was. I personally walked the entire property line with the owners and the county assessor." "And how was the eastern boundary defined?" Donovan didn't hesitate. "The deed specified Cypress Creek as the natural eastern boundary. We placed marker stakes along the creek bank at that time." "Thank you, Mr. Donovan," Eastwood said. "No further questions." Reynolds approached, looking increasingly frustrated. "Mr. Donovan, after 70 years, how can you possibly remember the details of one specific property survey?" The old surveyor smiled slightly. "Young man, when you survey Clint Eastwood's property, you tend to remember it. But more importantly, I remember because it was one of the first creek boundary properties I worked on. We had quite a discussion about using natural boundaries versus fixed measurements, and you didn't think to note this special arrangement in the county records?" "I did note it," Donovan replied firmly. "It's right there in the original survey notes. Eastern boundary follows creek center line as natural division. It's been in the county records for 7 decades. Reynolds looked startled. "I don't recall seeing any such notation in the records we reviewed." Judge Henderson raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Reynolds, are you suggesting that county records are incomplete?" "No, Your Honor," Reynolds backtracked quickly. "I'm simply saying our research team didn't encounter this specific notation." "Perhaps," Eastwood interjected quietly, "because you were looking for what you wanted to find, not what was actually there." Reynolds spun around. "Objection. That's an inappropriate characterization of our research methods." Judge Henderson sighed. "Mr. Eastwood, please refrain from editorial comments." But there was a hint of amusement in her eyes. After Donovan's testimony concluded, Reynolds called his own expert, a younger surveyor who relied heavily on digital measurements and satellite imagery. But under Eastwood's surprisingly skillful cross-examination, the expert was forced to admit he had never physically visited the property boundary in question, relying instead on computer models. "So," Eastwood summarized, "you're basing million-dollar development decisions on digital points on a screen rather than the actual land itself?" "Our methods are scientifically sound," the expert insisted defensively. "Science is important," Eastwood agreed. "But sometimes there's no substitute for walking the ground yourself. Some things you can't see from a satellite." As the afternoon wore on, Reynolds called 2 more witnesses, but their testimony seemed increasingly hollow against the straightforward evidence Eastwood had presented. Throughout it all, the actor-director maintained the same calm demeanor, his questions precise and to the point, never raising his voice yet somehow commanding complete attention. During a brief recess, Reynolds approached Eastwood at the water fountain. "My clients are getting nervous," he admitted, dropping his aggressive facade. "They've authorized me to discuss settlement options." Eastwood took a slow sip of water. "I'm not interested in selling if that's what you're suggesting." Reynolds lowered his voice. "They're prepared to be very generous, 7 figures. You could donate it to those wildlife preserves you care about." "It's not about money," Eastwood replied. "It's about respecting the land and its history." Reynolds shook his head in genuine puzzlement. "I don't understand, it's just 5 acres. Eastwood looked at him with something approaching pity. "That's why you're going to lose this case." Back in the courtroom, Judge Henderson checked the time. "It's getting late and we've heard substantial testimony. Mr. Eastwood, I understand your attorney is still unavailable." "That's correct, Your Honor." She nodded. "In that case, I think we'll adjourn for today and reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Mr. Reynolds, will you be presenting additional witnesses?" "We reserve that right, Your Honor, but we're also considering our options overnight." "Very well." She gathered her papers. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow." As people filed out, Eastwood remained seated, making notes on a legal pad. He felt a presence and looked up to find Judge Henderson standing nearby. "Mr. Eastwood," she said quietly, "may I speak frankly?" He nodded. "In 20 years on the bench, I've rarely seen a non-attorney present a case so effectively. You've clearly done your homework." "Thank you, Your Honor." She hesitated, then added, "I was wrong to mock you earlier. I made assumptions based on who I thought you were." Eastwood offered a small smile. "We all play roles, Your Honor. Sometimes people forget there's more beneath the surface." She nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed. See you tomorrow, Mr. Eastwood." As she walked away, Eastwood turned back to his notes. The case was far from over, but for the first time he felt the momentum shifting in his favor. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight he had preparations to make. His phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Almost there. How's it going?" Eastwood typed back a simple reply. "Just fine. But you might want to review the Gillespie precedent before tomorrow." He gathered his materials and headed for the exit, nodding politely to the court staff. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. A small group of reporters had gathered, alerted to the unusual proceedings inside. "Mr. Eastwood," one called out, "is it true you're representing yourself against Coastal Vision's development plans?" He paused, considering his words carefully. "Let's just say I'm standing up for what's right. Sometimes that's all any of us can do." With that, he descended the steps and walked to his waiting car, already mentally preparing for tomorrow's final act in this unexpected legal drama. The next morning, Eastwood arrived at the courthouse to find Tom Chambers waiting for him on the steps, looking both relieved and slightly embarrassed. "I can't believe you handled everything yourself," Tom said, shaking his head in amazement. "The clerk told me you were brilliant." Eastwood shrugged. "I had good material to work with. Still, most clients would have demanded a continuance or fallen apart under pressure." Tom patted his briefcase. "I reviewed the Gillespie case like you suggested. Clever angle, I wouldn't have thought of it. Sometimes a fresh perspective helps," Eastwood replied as they climbed the courthouse steps together. "How's your car?" "Total write-off. Electrical system fried." Tom grimaced. "But enough about that. I'm ready to take over today. You've done more than enough." Eastwood paused, considering this. Part of him felt he should hand the reins to the professional he'd hired. But another part, the director, the man who had spent decades trusting his instincts, felt differently. "Actually," he said slowly, "I'd like to finish what I started, if you don't mind." Tom looked surprised, then thoughtful. "It's unusual, but," he smiled, "who am I to argue with success? I'll be right beside you if you need anything." Inside, the courtroom was even more crowded than the previous day. Eastwood recognized several local reporters and even spotted a sketch artist from one of the networks. The story of the Hollywood legend representing himself had clearly gotten out. Reynolds and his team huddled at their table, looking considerably less confident than they had the day before. When Judge Henderson entered, Reynolds immediately stood. "Your Honor, before we continue, my clients would like to propose a compromise solution." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Proceed, Mr. Reynolds." Coastal Vision LLC is prepared to modify their development plans to preserve the creek and establish a 50-foot conservation easement along its banks. This would protect the natural feature while still allowing for reasonable development of the remaining property. Judge Henderson turned to Eastwood. "Mr. Eastwood, your response to this offer?" Eastwood glanced at Tom, who gave a subtle nod, indicating the offer had merit from a legal standpoint. But Eastwood hadn't come this far to settle for half measures. "Your Honor, while I appreciate the gesture, it doesn't address the fundamental issue. This isn't just about preserving the creek. It's about respecting legal boundaries that were established decades ago and have been consistently honored until Coastal Vision decided they were inconvenient." Reynolds frowned. "We're trying to be reasonable here, Mr. Eastwood." "Reasonable would have been researching the actual property boundaries before drawing up development plans," Eastwood replied calmly. "Reasonable would have been talking to neighbors and longtime residents who understand the land's history." Judge Henderson tapped her gavel lightly. "I take it you're declining the offer, Mr. Eastwood?" "I am, Your Honor." She nodded. "Very well. Mr. Reynolds, you may call your next witness." Reynolds sighed. "The defense calls Philip Anderson." A well-dressed man in his 50s took the stand. After being sworn in, he identified himself as the CEO of Coastal Vision LLC. "Mr. Anderson," Reynolds began, "could you explain your company's interest in this property?" Anderson leaned forward earnestly. "Certainly. Carmel by the Sea is one of California's most desirable locations. Our vision is to create environmentally conscious luxury homes that blend with the natural landscape while providing much-needed housing in an area with limited inventory." "And what steps did you take to verify the property boundaries before purchasing the land?" "We conducted standard due diligence. Title searches, survey reviews, consultations with local real estate experts. Everything indicated the boundary was where we believed it to be." Reynolds nodded sympathetically. "And what would the economic impact be if the court rules in Mr. Eastwood's favor?" "Substantial," Anderson replied gravely. "We've already invested over $3 million in planning, permits, and preliminary site work. If we lose the 5 acres in question, the entire project becomes economically unfeasible." "Thank you," Reynolds concluded. "No further questions." Eastwood rose slowly for cross-examination. Tom slid a few notes toward him, but Eastwood gently pushed them aside. He had his own approach in mind. "Mr. Anderson," he began, "you mentioned environmentally conscious luxury homes. Could you explain what that means exactly?" Anderson brightened. "Of course, our designs incorporate solar power, rainwater collection, and native landscaping. We are aiming for LEED Platinum certification." "Impressive," Eastwood acknowledged. "And how many trees would need to be removed to build these homes?" Anderson hesitated. "Well, some clearing would be necessary." "How many?" Eastwood pressed. "According to our environmental impact report, approximately 117 trees." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, including a grove of Monterey cypress trees that are over 200 years old. Anderson shifted uncomfortably. "There are some older trees, yes. And the homes themselves. What's the starting price point?" "We haven't finalized pricing, but given the location and amenities, probably around $4 million. Eastwood nodded thoughtfully. "So not exactly addressing the affordable housing crisis." "Objection," Reynolds called out. "Argumentative." "Sustained." Judge Henderson ruled, but her expression suggested she found the exchange illuminating. Eastwood changed tack. "Mr. Anderson, when did you first learn about the creek boundary issue?" "When Mr. Eastwood's attorney raised it in his objection to our permit application." "Not before purchasing the property?" "No. The surveys we commissioned showed fixed boundary lines." Eastwood picked up a document from his table. I have here the original environmental survey your company ordered. Page 17 mentions, and, I quote, potential boundary discrepancies related to watercourse migration. Did you read this report? Anderson looked startled. I don't recall that specific detail. We have specialists who review these technical documents. So you were aware there might be boundary issues but proceeded anyway? Objection, Reynolds interjected. Counsel is mischaracterizing the witness's testimony. I'm not counsel, Eastwood corrected mildly. I'm just asking questions. Judge. Henderson almost smiled. Objection overruled. The witness may answer. Anderson cleared his throat. We were aware there were some historical questions about the exact boundary, but our legal team assured us our claim was solid. I see, Eastwood said. One final question, Mr. Anderson. Have you ever actually walked along Cypress Creek yourself? The CEO blinked. No, I haven't had the opportunity. Thank you, Eastwood said simply, returning to his seat. Reynolds called 2 more witnesses, a real estate appraiser and a county planning commissioner, but neither added much weight to their case. As the afternoon wore on, it became increasingly clear that Coastal Vision's position was weakening. Finally, Reynolds announced, "The plaintiff rests, Your Honor." Judge Henderson turned to Eastwood. Mr. Eastwood, do you wish to present any rebuttal witnesses? Eastwood conferred briefly with Tom, then stood. Just one, Your Honor. I'd like to recall Frank Donovan. The elderly surveyor made his way to the stand once more. After being reminded he was still under oath, Eastwood approached with a rolled-up document. Mr. Donovan, I'd like you to examine this. Do you recognize it? The old man carefully unrolled what appeared to be a faded, hand-drawn map. His eyes widened. Well, This is my original field sketch from the 1952 survey. Where on earth did you find it? In my garage, Eastwood replied. The previous property owner gave it to me when I bought the land in 1969, said I might need it someday. Donovan shook his head in amazement. I haven't seen this in 70 years. This was before we made the official records. See these notes in the margins? These are my observations about the creek being the natural boundary. And are these consistent with your testimony yesterday? Absolutely. In fact, there's even more detail here. I noted that the property line should follow the creek's natural course even if shifted by time and nature's hand. That was standard language we used for natural boundaries back then. Reynolds approached for a closer look, his expression a mixture of frustration and resignation. Your Honor, while this is an interesting historical document, it doesn't override the official recorded survey. Judge Henderson studied the map carefully. Actually, Mr. Reynolds, in property law, original field notes can carry significant weight, especially when they clarify intent. And intent is at the heart of boundary disputes. She returned the map to Eastwood, who thanked Donovan and dismissed him. The judge checked the time. It's nearly 4 o'clock. I believe we've heard sufficient testimony from both sides. Are you prepared to make closing arguments? Both Reynolds and Eastwood nodded. Reynolds went first, making a passionate plea about progress, property rights, and the need for clarity in boundary determinations. He argued that modern precision should take precedence over vague historical references and hand-drawn maps. It was a skilled performance, but it lacked the conviction of his opening statement. When Eastwood's turn came, he rose slowly and addressed the court without notes. Your Honor, this case isn't really about property lines on a map. It's about respecting history and understanding the land itself. His gravelly voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the room. When those original boundaries were drawn, the surveyors didn't just measure distances. They looked at the land, understood its character, and recognized that some features, like Cypress Creek, were meant to be preserved, not just as boundaries, but as living parts of the landscape. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Coastal Vision sees 5 acres as a space to build houses. I see it as part of a legacy, not just my legacy, but a legacy that belongs to the land itself and to future generations who deserve to experience it as nature intended. Eastwood gestured toward the window where late afternoon sunlight streamed in. Your Honor, I've been fortunate enough to live a long life and to tell many stories. but the story of this land began long before me and will continue long after. All I'm asking is that we honor the truth of that story, a truth that's written in creek beds and property maps, in the memories of men like Frank Donovan, and in the common sense understanding that some boundaries weren't meant to be drawn with rulers but with respect for the land itself. He returned to his seat as a hush fell over the courtroom. Judge Henderson sat motionless for a moment, then nodded. Thank you both for your arguments. This case presents interesting questions about how we define boundaries, not just in legal terms but in how we relate to the land itself. She gathered her papers. I'll take this under advisement and deliver my ruling tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. As the judge left the bench, reporters rushed toward the exit, eager to file their stories. Tom clapped Eastwood on the shoulder. That was one hell of a closing argument. Where'd you learn to speak like that? Eastwood smiled slightly. Decades of reading scripts. You start to get a feel for what works. Reynolds approached, extending his hand. Whatever the outcome, Mr. Eastwood, that was impressive advocacy. Eastwood shook the offered hand. You fought well yourself, Mr. Reynolds. Not well enough, I suspect, Reynolds replied ruefully. My clients are already discussing appeal options. That's their right, Eastwood acknowledged. But sometimes, it's better to accept when a story has reached its natural conclusion. As they left the courtroom, a young law student approached Eastwood hesitantly. Mr. Eastwood, I just wanted to say, that was incredible. I've never seen anything like it. Neither have I, Tom added with a laugh. And I've been practicing law for 30 years. Eastwood nodded his thanks and headed for the exit. Tomorrow would bring Judge Henderson's decision, but in his heart, he already knew how this particular story would end. The morning of the ruling dawned clear and bright in Carmel. Eastwood rose early, as was his habit. At 95, he still maintained the IED discipline that had carried him through decades in Hollywood. Up before the sun, a simple breakfast and time to gather his thoughts before the day's challenges. He stood on his back porch, coffee in hand, looking out over the disputed land. Deer grazed peacefully near Cypress Creek, unaware of the human drama that would determine their fate. The morning light filtered through ancient trees, creating patterns on the forest floor that no developer's blueprint could ever capture. Tom called just as Eastwood was leaving for the courthouse. How are you feeling? The attorney asked. Fine, Eastwood replied simply. Nervous at all? Eastwood considered this. Throughout his career, he'd faced countless opening nights, award ceremonies, and high-stakes film productions. But this felt different, more personal somehow. Not nervous, he said finally. Just ready for it to be done. The courthouse is packed, Tom warned. Reporters everywhere. This has become quite the story. Wasn't my intention, Eastwood said. I know. But people love seeing David take on Goliath. Even when David is Clint Eastwood. Eastwood chuckled. See you there. When he arrived at the courthouse, he had to navigate through a small crowd of reporters and onlookers. Most respected his privacy, though a few called out questions. He nodded politely, but kept moving, his focus on the day ahead. Inside courtroom 8, it seemed as if the entire county had turned out for the ruling. Every bench was filled with people standing along the back wall. Eastwood spotted Frank Donovan, the elderly surveyor, seated near the front. The old man gave him a thumbs up. Reynolds and his team looked tense, huddled in last-minute consultation. When they saw Eastwood enter, Reynolds nodded in professional acknowledgement, but the CEO, Anderson, deliberately looked away. Tom met Eastwood at their table. Whatever happens, you should be proud. You stood up for what's right. Eastwood arranged his papers methodically. Did you file those environmental impact statements I mentioned? First thing this morning, Tom confirmed, though I'm not sure they'll factor into today's ruling. Maybe not, Eastwood agreed, but they'll matter if there's an appeal. Always thinking ahead, it was the director in him, planning the next scene even as the current one unfolded. At precisely 10 a.m., the bailiff called the court to order. Judge Henderson entered, her expression unreadable as she took her seat and arranged her papers. Good morning, she began, After careful consideration of the evidence and arguments presented, I'm prepared to issue my ruling in the matter of Coastal Vision LLC versus Eastwood. The courtroom fell completely silent. Eastwood sat perfectly still, his face impassive, despite the stakes. This case, the judge continued, presents an interesting tension between modern precision and historical intent. On one hand, we have contemporary surveys using advanced technology. On the other, we have original documents and testimony speaking to the understanding of those who first established these boundaries. She looked directly at Reynolds. Mr. Reynolds has argued persuasively that property law requires clarity and certainty, and that modern measurements should take precedence over historical references. Reynolds straightened slightly, sensing a favorable ruling. Anderson leaned forward eagerly, but Judge Henderson wasn't finished. However, California law has long recognized that the original intent of property divisions carries significant weight, particularly when natural features are specifically designated as boundaries. Held up the faded field sketch Eastwood had produced. This document, while not an official county record, provides compelling evidence of the original surveyor's intent. Mr. Donovan's testimony further confirms that Cypress Creek was meant to serve as a natural living boundary, one that could shift over time while still fulfilling its purpose as a property line. The judge set the sketch aside and folded her hands. After reviewing all evidence, including the geological survey documenting the creek's movement, I find that the original intent was for the property boundary to follow Cypress Creek in its natural course, wherever that might be over time. Murmur swept through the courtroom. Anderson whispered urgently to Reynolds, who shook his head slightly, urging patience. Therefore, Judge Henderson continued, I rule that the boundary between the properties follows the current path of Cypress Creek, not its 1952 location. This places the disputed 5 acres within Mr. Eastwood's property line. The courtroom erupted in applause. The bailiff called for order, but Judge Henderson let the reaction continue for a moment before raising her hand for silence. I have one additional observation, she said when quiet returned. This case has reminded me of something we sometimes forget in our modern rush for development and progress. The land we live on has its own history, its own character. The early surveyors understood this when they chose to let a creek define a boundary rather than imposing artificial lines. She looked directly at Eastwood. Mr. Eastwood, your advocacy in this case has been remarkable, not just for someone without formal legal training, but for any litigant. You've demonstrated that understanding the spirit of the law can be as important as knowing its letter. Then, she turned to Reynolds and his clients. As for Coastal Vision LLC, while I've ruled against you today, I hope you'll consider how development might better honor the natural features of the land you build on. The most enduring structures are those that work with the landscape, not against it. With a rap of her gavel, she concluded, Judgment for the defendant. Court is adjourned. The courtroom once again broke into applause as Judge Henderson left the bench. Reporters rushed for the doors, eager to file their stories. Tom shook Eastwood's hand vigorously. Congratulations. I couldn't have won it better myself. Eastwood nodded, allowing himself a small smile of satisfaction. Across the aisle, Anderson was berating Reynolds in hushed but angry tones. The attorney looked resigned, knowing they had lost to a superior case, not just a famous opponent. Frank Donovan made his way slowly to Eastwood's table. You did it, son, he said, his eyes bright with emotion. You protected the creek. Why did it, Eastwood corrected, shaking the old surveyor's hand. Your testimony made all the difference. As they prepared to leave, Reynolds approached alone. My clients are considering an appeal, he said without preamble. Eastwood nodded. They're right. But I've advised against it, Reynolds continued. Judge Henderson's ruling is solid. I don't see an appellate court overturning it. What will they do with the land they still own? Eastwood asked. Reynolds shrugged. Probably sell it. Without those 5 acres, their development plan isn't viable. I might be interested in buying it, Eastwood said quietly. For conservation purposes. Reynolds looked surprised, then thoughtful. I can bring that offer to them. It might be the cleanest resolution for everyone. They shook hands, professional adversaries recognizing each other's strengths. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Some were fans, others local residents who cared about the land. They applauded as Eastwood emerged. A young reporter pushed forward with a microphone. "Mr. Eastwood, how does it feel to win against a major developer?" Eastwood paused. "It feels right. Not because I won, but because the land won. Did you ever doubt you could handle this case yourself?" He smiled slightly. "When you reach my age, you learn not to doubt yourself. You just do what needs doing." "What's next for the disputed land now that you've secured it?" "It stays as it is," Eastwood replied simply. "The deer in the trees don't need improvement." As the questions continued, Judge Henderson exited the courthouse. She spotted Eastwood surrounded by reporters and waited until the interview concluded before approaching. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, extending her hand, "I meant what I said in there. Your advocacy was exceptional. Thank you, Your Honor. Coming from you, that means something." She hesitated, then added with a smile, "I have a confession to make. When you first stood up to represent yourself, I thought it was just Hollywood ego. I was wrong, and I'm not. Too proud to admit it." "We all make judgments," Eastwood replied. "The important thing is being willing to revise them when the evidence changes." She nodded appreciatively. "Wise words. Have you ever considered a second career in law?" Eastwood chuckled. "I think I'll stick to what I know, but this was educational. For all of us," the judge agreed. Later that afternoon, Eastwood walked along Cypress Creek, following its winding path through the woods. The legal battle was over, but he knew the larger fight to protect places like this would continue long after he was gone. He stopped where the creek widened into a small pool, watching the play of light on water. In his decades of filmmaking, he'd tried to capture moments of natural beauty, to freeze them in time. But the real thing, ever-changing, alive, could never truly be captured, only experienced. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter. "Saw the news. So proud of you, Dad. Saving the world one creek at a time." He smiled and put the phone away, continuing his walk. He wasn't saving the world, just a small piece of it. But sometimes, that was enough. As evening approached, he sat on his porch, looking out over the land that would now remain undeveloped. In Hollywood, he had created many endings, some happy, some tragic, some ambiguous. But this ending felt particularly right. The next morning's newspaper would carry the headline, "Eastwood wins landmark property case. Judge acknowledges actor's surprising legal skills." There would be interviews and probably book offers. The story had all the elements people loved: celebrity, drama, a courtroom showdown. But for Eastwood himself, the victory was quieter and more personal. It wasn't about winning a case or proving something to a doubtful judge. It was about honoring a promise he'd made to himself when he first bought this land, to protect it, to respect it, and to ensure that some things remained unchanged in a world that changed too quickly. As darkness fell, he could hear the gentle sound of Cypress Creek flowing through the woods. It had been flowing for centuries before any property lines were drawn, and thanks to today's victory, it would continue flowing freely for years to come. In a career filled with achievements, this might not make the highlight reel when people spoke of Clint Eastwood's legacy. But sitting there in the gathering darkness, listening to the creek that had become so central to this unexpected chapter of his life, he knew it was one of the most important things he'd ever done. Not bad, he thought with quiet satisfaction, for a man who'd started out just trying to protect his property line and ended up defending something much more valuable. The simple idea that some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed, and some places deserve to remain exactly as nature intended them to be,